Hello to our friends joining us via recording. We are starting lesson number 11 about the brain. To get us ready to talk about the way that the brain works, we're doing a little bit of lab review. So when we worked on the brain in lab lesson number 9, we identified a lot of different structures in the brain. So we're going to go through and label a sketch of the brain with some of those major structures that we talked about in lab. So let's start with a basic question here. Is it the side over here on the left or the side over here on the right that is the front part of the brain? Which side of my picture is anterior or the front? Yeah, so my friends in the chat are correct. This is the anterior part of the brain, the front part of the brain. This is the back part of the brain, the posterior part. So the lobe of the brain that is most anterior, that's shown here in blue, what's the name of this lobe right here, shown in blue? Yeah, the blue lobe is the one that's in the front. So the blue lobe is the frontal lobe. We've got the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is the very front part of the brain. What's the name of this pink or red lobe here in the back part of the brain? Who lives in the very back? Yeah, the very back part next to the occipital bone is the occipital lobe of the brain. So the occipital lobe of the brain, the lobe in the very back of the brain. When I talk about this green lobe here on the lateral portion of the brain, what's this green one right here? Yeah, green lobe is the temporal lobe here on the side. And up above it, that yellow one is the last lobe we have left, right? What's that last one? Yep, parietal lobe in yellow. Draw a line for that one because that yellow barely shows up. All right, so we've labeled our lobes. That leaves me with this structure down here. It's underneath all those lobes of the brain, or the cerebrum. Yeah, this part down here is called the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, I'll type that name. The cerebellum. Its name, I told you when we were talking about lab stuff, is like little cerebrum, is basically what it means. It has a lot of those same features as the cerebrum does. So the cerebellum down below. Now, there are two bumps that we talked about in lab that are going to be really important here in lecture, called the post-central gyrus and the pre-central gyrus. The post-central gyrus and the pre-central gyrus are the bumps that I find in front of and behind a thing called the central sulcus. Central sulcus. And I didn't have you label it on the picture, but the central sulcus is this dark line right here. The central sulcus being this dark line right here. The central sulcus divides up the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So that's how I know it's this thing right here. When I point to the bump that's right here in front of the central sulcus, what's this bump right here called? Yeah, this is the one that's in front. So the one that's in front is the pre-central gyrus, pre-central gyrus, because it's in front of the central sulcus, which means that the one back behind it, I just drew a line on for us, that's the post-central gyrus. Oh, spelled that wrong. Post-central gyrus, back behind it. So we've labeled the anatomy or the locations of these major structures in the brain. Now let's remind ourselves of our lab-based functions for some of these parts of the brain. So when we're talking about the function of the cerebellum, that little cerebrum, what was kind of the key word that we said with the cerebellum? What does the cerebellum help us out with? Yeah, Christina's right. The technical word for it is equilibrium. The normal person word for it, like Tierney said for us, is balance. Your cerebellum is really important for helping you to balance. The other thing we're going to talk about the cerebellum being important for is it helps to make your movements not look funny, basically. So it helps to coordinate motor movements and it helps with balance. Hey, we have a lab exam coming up, as we're all painfully aware, right? We talked about a cranial nerve that helps us with balance, or it helps us with equilibrium. Does anyone remember what cranial nerve helps us with balance or with equilibrium? Wow, props to Christina, typing that big long name. I think you're just missing an extra C, or you might be completely right, actually. I'm not going to make you spell it. Vestibulocochlear nerve, what number is that? That should be easier to type than its name, right? Ooh, not number 12. Yeah. Yeah, Jesse's right. That's actually cranial nerve number 8. If you remember our creepy clown, how we drew the cranial nerves. So you do balance or you do equilibrium around your ears. Cranial nerve number 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, collects information and sends a bunch of it to the cerebellum to help you with balancing. So the cerebellum works together with cranial nerve number 8 to help you maintain your balance. Little extra lab correlation for us there. When we talk about the frontal lobe, what was the thing from my list over here that we said the frontal lobe was important for? What's the frontal lobe involved in? Yeah, so frontal lobe from our list here, personality. Personality comes from the frontal lobe. Perhaps you've heard of the thing called the prefrontal cortex. Let me type that here. Prefrontal cortex. That is the personality center of your brain. That's the thing when you were growing up, and maybe it was just me, I don't know. I always had adults telling me, well, your brain's not fully developed yet, so you can't make this decision. Did anyone else have parents that told you that, or was it just mine? Yeah, okay, so I wasn't the only one. Tierney had parents say that too. So the prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that does personality, or it does reasoning, those kinds of things. So those kinds of higher level functions, if you will, come from the frontal lobe. I know Christina mentioned, and I saw this in at least one of my groups, talking about smell in the frontal lobe. Not quite accurate, actually. The frontal lobe is in the front half of the brain. So the frontal lobe is involved in motor functions. Whether that's motor in the sense of like deciding what you're like, or whether it's motor in the sense of making you do movements. That's what we normally think of with motor. So I wouldn't do the sense of smell with the frontal lobe. We'll come back to the sense of smell. Oh yeah, no, you're totally fine, Christina. Like, it's not a problem. For the record, this is a safe space. If we make mistakes, I totally don't care. Do you guys remember how many mistakes I made on Monday? Like, come on, I was having trouble. So no worries at all, Christina. You're good. So we're gonna keep this smell thing in the back of our mind. We're gonna come back to that one. When we talk about the frontal lobe from lab, we said that that's the personality part. The frontal lobe had one of these bumps in it. Which of these bumps was in the frontal lobe? Do we remember? Yeah, the precentral gyrus is in the frontal lobe. It's the very end of the frontal lobe, the precentral gyrus. Since we said that the frontal lobe does motor stuff, do we want to guess what kind of stuff the precentral gyrus does? Not a trick question, I promise. Yeah, the precentral gyrus, because it's part of my motor lobe, is the place in particular where I find what's called the primary motor area, or what we're going to call it during our class time in lecture is we're going to call it the motor homunculus. So I know we got some questions about the homunculus. Don't worry, we'll spend plenty of time working on that. The precentral gyrus, the bump in the frontal lobe, is the location where I have what's called the motor homunculus, or think about this homunculus word like a map. I have a map all along this one particular bump that helps me to control various parts of my body. So the precentral gyrus has the primary motor area. Okay, while we're talking about these gyri, let's toss out too that the post-central gyrus, that's going to be the place where we have what's called the sensory homunculus, or the primary sensory area of the brain. Now, here's some terminology that we're going to talk more about in the last unit of our class here. The post-central gyrus with that primary sensory area, it's going to collect what's called general sensory information. General sensory information. I guess we kind of talk about this in this lecture too. General sensory information is stuff like touch or temperature or stretching. When we talk about some of the other functions that are on this list, like vision, things like hearing or smell or equilibrium, those are what we call special sensory information. And we're going to do a whole lab next week about some of these types of special sensory information. We're going to do a whole lecture. Our last lecture lesson is about special sensory information. So when we talk about that general stuff, like I said, temperature, touch, pain, that's going to go to this post-central gyrus. All of my special sensory information actually gets sent to its own special places or special lobes in the brain. So let's start with the one that I think we're probably most familiar with. The part of the brain that's helping with vision. Which lobe of the brain do I send vision information? Yeah, Jesse's right. We're nervous about it. The part of the brain that does vision, that's the occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe of the brain, the very back lobe of the brain, that's where I send visual information. So the occipital lobe, vision. When we talk about the process of hearing, which lobe of the brain does hearing? Yeah, hearing is done by the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe being the lobe that's right by the ears. I know I heard my group saying that. So one of my groups, because now we're here to smell. One of my groups thought smell was the frontal lobe. One of my groups thought smell was the post-central gyrus. It is actually neither of those. Do we have any other guesses what part of the brain does smell? Yeah, so Jesse was a little bit unsure about it. Jacqueline guessed it too. It's weird, but true that the temporal lobe of your brain, in addition to helping you with hearing, also helps you with the process of smell. So yeah, I know Jacqueline said that she forgot about that. Yeah, it was a little random tidbit. So when we're learning our functions of the lobes for lab, the big one that we're thinking about with the temporal lobe is hearing. But interestingly, the temporal lobe also does the process of smell. So we're going to tie in a lot of these functions and these structures during our class today. Keep in mind that your lab packet is always a great supplement for your lecture stuff. So our stuff from lab tying in with today's lecture. So let's look at the first picture that's specifically from the lecture packet here. This picture shows me the 4 main regions of the brain. So when we talk about the 4 main regions of the brain, that's the big picture parts of the brain. We have the cerebrum, which is divided into 2 halves called hemispheres. Remember that the cerebral hemispheres are where we find the frontal lobe or the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe. All that's the cerebral hemispheres. In the very middle of the brain, we have some of those parts that we could only see on our brain models when we were inside. So those were the parts called the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. If you remember from our lab discussion, though, that we said that what we were knowing of the epithalamus was the pineal gland. So the only part of the epithalamus we're really going to talk about in lecture, and all that really matters for lab, is that pineal gland. These 3 structures here, all the ones that have this word thalamus in their name, together they make up a part of the brain that you're really glad you don't have to spell for me, called the diencephalon. Diencephalon. So that's the inside part of the brain. The big thalamus, the hypothalamus that hangs down below, and the little epithalamus that would be up higher. Then we get into these parts here shown in green that are called the brain stem. In general, when we think about the function of the brain stem, what's kind of big picture the job of the brain stem? Any ideas? Biggest picture, what that does? Yeah, so biggest picture, if you're trying to remember what any of these parts of the brain do for us, you're in good shape if you say they keep you alive. Absolutely. So things like breathing, your heart rate, yeah, all those lovely reflexes, the vomiting, coughing, sneezing reflexes, those all come from this area. So it's all about keeping you alive. That's the brain stem. Cerebellum, that last area here in the back. Here's a little teaser for you. We've got the exam coming up, so you're starting to need to think about current events in anatomy. There are a couple of articles actually in the big database about individuals who are born without a cerebellum. So if you're interested in hearing about some of the things besides just balance that the cerebellum helps you with, there are a couple of articles about people that they've found out don't have a cerebellum. So very interesting actually to learn about that. So we said that the brainstem keeps you alive. We said that the cerebellum helps you with balance and coordination. When we talk about the cerebrum, think about the cerebrum with all of its lobes and all of its gyri and sulci and stuff. I like to think about the cerebrum as the part that makes you human. So all of your functions that aren't just breathing and vomiting and your heart beating, those kind of things all come from up here, those big picture functions. Tierney had asked a question that I had missed. She asked about sensory versus motor neurons in the cerebrum. So just to tie that in, the only place in the cerebrum where we're going to have motor neurons is going to be here in the frontal lobe, especially here in this pre-central gyrus, so the bump in front of the central sulcus. That's going to be a lot of motor neurons here, and then some motor neurons in the rest of the frontal lobe. Everything behind that pre-central gyrus, so my parietal lobe, my temporal lobe, my occipital lobe, all of those are going to have sensory neurons. Or if it's not sensory neurons that they might have interneurons. What's the function of an interneuron? Interneurons. Do you remember those ones? Exactly. Yep. My interneurons are my integrating neurons or my processing neurons. So I'm going to send sensory information up here into my sensory parts of the brain, but I'm also going to process it there as well. So sensory neurons and interneurons primarily in this area, motor neurons and interneurons here in the front. Now, when we look at the brain, and here's where I wish that we could have been, well, for many times this semester, we wish that we could have been together in person, right? We actually have some cross sections of human brains that look like this in the lab that are fascinating to look at. They're fascinating to look at because you can see a difference between the two kinds of matter that make up the brain. So the brain has what's called gray matter on the outside and white matter on the inside. When we talked about the spinal cord, was there gray matter or white matter on the outside of the spinal cord? Where was the white matter in the spinal cord? The outside or in the middle? Ooh, I don't quite remember. Here, let me draw you a little sketch of the spinal cord here. It's going to look really terrible, but here we go. I don't have as much practice drawing spinal cords. When we talk about the spinal cord, ooh, this is going to look real bad. Here we go. If you can interpret this drawing, you are so prepared for the lab exam. Here is my terrible drawing of the spinal cord here. When we talk about the spinal cord, we had gray matter in the middle arranged in things. What were these little things in the middle called? Does anyone remember what we called the gray matter in the spinal cord? Yeah, the gray matter in the spinal cord was called horns. So I did a terrible sketch here. Here's my little lateral horns that are sticking out really laterally. And then I've got my dorsal horns here. What did that word dorsal mean again? What was dorsal? Yeah, posterior, toward the backside. So here's my backside horns, my dorsal horns. Here's my ventral horns on the front side. When we look at the spinal cord, the gray matter is in the middle of the spinal cord. When we look at the brain, the gray matter is on the outside of the brain. The reason that the brain literally looks like it has different colors, and yes, those brains I was talking about in the lab are actual human brains. So the reason in actual human brains, like the ones we have in the lab, why it looks different is because of the amount of myelin. So what makes us have a difference between gray matter and white matter is the amount of myelin that we have in the brain. When we talk about myelin, let me type its little name here. When we talk about myelin, what are some of the things that we remember, the important ideas about myelin from our last lecture? Things like, what's it made out of? What's its job? What do we know about myelin? Yeah, so myelin is made out of fats or lipids. Myelin is lipids. Yep, and it's made by Schwann cells. Schwann cells. So it's a layer of lipids made by Schwann cells, and we're absolutely right. It helps to send messages. It helps to send messages quickly, and I'll add, and correctly. Because if we take off our myelin sheath, or if we damage our myelin sheath, we might actually send the wrong message. So the difference between gray matter and white matter is the amount of myelin that's present in those parts of the brain. When we talked about myelin, which specific part of a neuron was covered in myelin? Yeah. So it was the axon of a neuron, the long part that sticks out on a neuron, that's covered in myelin. When we're looking inside the brain here and we see the white parts of the brain, the parts of the brain that we're seeing here in white are primarily where I find myelinated axons. So where I find the parts of my neurons that are completely covered in myelin. Because myelin is fat, it looks really light in color. The parts of the brain that look more gray are going to be the parts of neurons that typically don't have a lot or any myelin on them. So it's places like the cell bodies, it's places like these little extensions off the cell bodies. What are these little extensions called that come off of the cell body of a neuron? Yeah, these little parts out here, my parts that I call the dendrites. Dendrites, no myelin. Cell body, no myelin. There are some neurons in the body that even on their axons don't have myelin either. So if you're a neuron that has no myelin on your axon, or if you are a neuron that does have myelin on your axon, but you travel a long distance, you could have your cell body with those dendrites up here in the gray matter and have your axon extending here in the white matter. Here's kind of the big picture with the brain. We've got gray matter and we've got white matter that look different. It's all about the amount of myelin that we have in those places. My anatomy is different because I have less myelin on the outside and more myelin in the middle. But remember, this is anatomy and physiology class, right? So my anatomy of these two parts is different, which means my physiology must be different as well. When we think about the part of the neuron that's covered in myelin, when we think about the axon of a neuron, what might we say is the job of a neuron's axon? What does the axon do? Yeah, I've got some good ideas coming here into the chat. The axon is that long part that sticks out from a neuron that a neuron uses to send a message away. When a neuron has done summation and it's figured out that it should be talking to its neighbor, the axon is the part that allows it to take that message all the way down to its neighbors down here at the axon terminals. Correlation between my neuron part and the brain then. When we think about the parts of the brain that have white matter, that have a lot of myelin sheaths, consider then that this white matter part of the brain is really good at sending messages, or it's really good at transporting information. When we think about the gray matter of the brain, this is the part where we had things like those dendrites, and this is the part where we had things like the cell body and the axon hillock right here. What are some of the functions of those dendrites, of that axon hillock? What are some of the things that gray matter might be good at doing based on what it has? Dendrites and axon hillocks. Perfect. Yeah, so when we talk about the dendrites, we talked about those kind of like a receiver dish, a satellite dish, receiving information. So the first function of gray matter is getting information, like that sensory information that you touched something, or like that smell information that you smelled something. But the other important job of gray matter that a couple of us honed in on too is the job of this axon hillock part of a neuron. Remember that this is the part of the neuron where I do summation, where I add together a bunch of messages, put them in a blender, mix it up, see what spits out. I do the processing of those messages that I get at the dendrites here at the axon hillock. So the other thing that gray matter in the brain is going to do for me is it's going to help me to process. White matter, really good at sending messages. Gray matter, really good at receiving messages and processing messages. Most of the processing, most of the receiving of messages happens here on the outside of the brain. Most of the gray matter is arranged in those bumps called gyri, or those indentations called sulci. But here's one other thing that I want you to underline, highlight, star. These things right here, called the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei. These are groups of gray matter that's found in the very middle of the brain, in the very middle of the cerebrum. So most of the gray matter of the brain is on the outside in something that we call the cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex on the outside. Some of it, though, in the very middle in what we call the basal nuclei. For the most part, though, most of what's on the inside is that white matter. And remind me, white matter had a lot or a little myelin? How much myelin is in white matter? Yeah, myelin, there's a lot of myelin in white matter, absolutely. So this is my part of the brain that sends messages. It's going to send messages to different places here in the gray matter, where it's receiving and processing those messages. How do we feel about the anatomy and physiology of gray matter and white matter? Thumbs up, thumbs down, questions? Perfect. Yes, so Nicole asked about the function of the basal nuclei. We will actually talk about them. I'm not sure if it'll be today or if it's going to be next time, but the basal nuclei are involved in movement. Specifically, the basal nuclei, again, we'll talk about this more, but specifically their job is to stop movements that you don't want to happen. So they block unwanted movements. Yeah, we get to do a whole little discussion of them because there are a couple of diseases that relate to those basal nuclei. So I can't vouch for the validity of this picture, but this picture is really cool to me if it's real, maybe. This is what Dr. Allis looks at on Pinterest, by the way, anatomy pictures like this one. This picture is showing us the gray matter of the brain on the outside, arranged in those bumps, remember the gyri, and then you can see those sulci down in between. But what's cool is they've taken away some of that gray matter on the outside of the brain to show us the white matter in the brain. So if you remember from lab, when we were talking about the white matter of the brain, or of the spinal cord, excuse me, we said that the white matter of the spinal cord, the fancy word for it is we called it funiculi. But in our class, we're calling the white matter tracts. So this word tracts means that it's groups of myelinated axons that all travel together. You can see them here in these lines. So this is groups of neurons that are all going the same direction to transport information. Because remember, the white matter is the axon parts of the neurons. So I can see all these groups of axons that travel together on either side of the brain. Those are tracts that we have in the white matter of the brain. Now, when we talk about tracts, which is the way that white matter is arranged, there are a few different kinds of tracts that we have in the brain. Anytime, but here's a note for us to remember. Anytime we're talking about tracts, we're talking about transporting information. White matter is always about transporting information. So I name different tracts based on where they transport information to. So the first kind of tracts that I have in the brain are called association tracts. When you think about an association tract is where I take some information and I associate it with, or I process it based on other information that I already have. So for example, you smell something, and then we need to associate that smell with something I've smelled in the past to say, oh, that's coffee, or oh, that's chocolate, or oh, that's pizza. A little view into my psyche there, the kinds of smells I like to associate with right now. So association tracts, you get some kind of information and you send it in the same hemisphere or somewhere really close to figure out what it means. So association tracts send information in the same hemisphere, the same half of the brain. If you look closely at this picture, notice how there's some space, like right here, for example, where I see some axons that are going sideways. Or if I look down here, I've got some more that are kind of going a little bit sideways. When I send information within the same hemisphere, so all my information in the left or just information here in the right, I would use an association tract to send that information in the same hemisphere of the brain. When I want to send information to the other hemisphere of the brain, I'm going to use what's called a commissural tract. Make sure I spell this right. Commissural tract. When I send information through a commissural tract, information goes to the opposite hemisphere. The opposite hemisphere, meaning it's going to the other side of the brain. Usually, we can't process fully what we're seeing, feeling, smelling with just one side of the brain. Both of our sides of the brain work together to do that. Now, in lab, we talked about one really important commissural tract. You can actually see it right here. It was that band of white matter in the middle of the brain that I told you, you absolutely must know this. Does anyone remember what that white matter C was in the brain? Yeah. Jesse is a typing fiend because that's a long one, not English. The biggest commissural tract in the brain is called the corpus callosum. Hopefully that name rings a bell for you. Corpus callosum. The corpus callosum, in lab, we were talking about how that connects the left and the right side of the brain. So right here, the white matter area of the brain that connects the left side and the right side to each other, allows them to talk to one another. That's commissural tract, connecting the two hemispheres or the two halves of the brain. The other kind of tract that we have in the brain, or at least that starts in the brain, is something called a projection tract. And in a projection tract, information is sent out of the brain. Info leaves the brain. It projects out. So when we're talking about sending directions for movement out of the brain down to your muscles, I would use a projection tract. Or if we're sending information into the brain, something that you're feeling, you're touching something, that would come into the brain using a projection tract. So the three kinds of white matter in the brain are, first, the kinds of white matter that keeps information in the same hemisphere, left or right, to help us process it closely. Could be, the second type, are what we call commissural tracts, where we go from left side to right side. Or finally, we have what are called projection tracts, when I send information out or bring information in to the brain. That's what's going on with the white matter in the brain. Let's switch gears. Instead of talking about that white matter in the middle of the brain, now we're going to switch gears and move to the outside and talk about the gray matter in the outside of the brain. Remind me in the chat again, what did we say some of the things that the gray matter of the brain was good at doing? What were some of the functions of the brain's gray matter? Perfect. Yep, we're using the parts of the neurons to help us out. The gray matter is the part that received information. It's the part that processed information. It's doing summation with that information. So when we talk about the gray matter, these are going to be the parts of the brain that are processing sensory information, figuring out what we should be doing with that information. So we already mentioned this terminology before, and you see it in your lesson outline, how we have what's called special sensory information, and we have what's called general sensory information. When we talk about seeing, the process of vision, was that something that we said was a special sense or a general sense? Do you remember? Yeah, the process of seeing is one of our special senses. Let's make a list for us here. So the process of seeing, or what's called vision, technically speaking, vision is one of our special senses. Hearing is another special sense. We have 3 other special senses. Can anyone help me in the chat? What are some of those other special senses that our body has? Yep, taste is another one. Here's the technical word I'll give you because it'll come back for us. It's called gustation. Another one being the sense of smell. Here's our fancy anatomy word for smell. It's called olfaction. And then our final one is balance, absolutely, which the fancy anatomy word for is equilibrium. Okay, so 5 kinds of special sensory information that we process in the body. With this special sensory information, for the most part, I not only send it to a specific place in the brain, but I also process it in that same kind of place of the brain. So we're looking here at something that's called an fMRI. So let me type that for you. fMRI, which is also known as a functional MRI. A functional MRI, which means that a person is actually doing a brain function and we're watching to see what's happening. So in particular, this person is doing the process of vision. They're seeing something. When we look at these fMRIs, the parts of them that are hotter, it's a heat map, so red and orange, those are the parts that are activated. There's extra blood flow going to those parts. The parts that are green or blue just have kind of a normal amount of blood flow. When I'm looking here at a person who's seeing something, which lobe of the brain is lighting up? Which lobe of the brain is processing information when we see? Yeah, so we're lighting up that back lobe back here, right? So the process of vision, we send all of the visual information that we receive back to the primary visual area. So this place here in the occipital lobe, the first place that we send information to there in the occipital lobe is called the primary visual area. Information comes straight back here. I receive it, but very shortly after I receive that visual information, I need to figure out what it means or what I'm looking at. So right next door to the primary visual area, I'm also going to have, oops, let's see if I can move it here. I'm going to have what's called the visual association area. Visual association area. I know it's slightly chopped out, but you can see it kind of. The visual association area is going to help me to process or make sense of what I'm actually seeing. So the primary visual area is where I send information that comes in through my eyeballs. The visual association area helps me to figure out what exactly it is that I'm seeing. Hey, I promise this is not a trick question. To get information from the primary visual area, where it first goes, to the visual association area, where I figure out what it means, which kind of white matter tract helps me to send information between these two places. Yeah, so promise it's not a trick question. Going from the primary visual area to the visual association area, I'm going to use an association tract. So staying inside the same hemisphere, just going from one place to another place, I would use an association tract to help me do that. So to send information in the same lobe. First place information goes is a primary visual area. Then I send it to the visual association area. Notice down here, we are looking at what's called an fMRI, a functional MRI, of someone doing the process of hearing. When I'm doing the process of hearing, remind me, and this picture can help us out here, remind me which lobe of the brain does hearing? Where does hearing happen? Exactly. Hearing is happening in that temporal lobe. Temporal lobe. So when we do the process of hearing, we send the sounds that are collected by our ears to the primary auditory area, or the primary auditory cortex, you might see it called. Then to help us figure out what we're hearing, whether we're hearing music, whether we're hearing noise, whether I'm hearing my baby cry, that kind of stuff goes to the auditory association area. Auditory association area. Again, I'm going to use those association tracts to help me send information from where it's first received to where I can figure out what it is. Now, these particular pictures occur later in your lesson packet, but I wanted to toss them up here just to show you something kind of cool. When we do the process of seeing something, we're all influencing that occipital lobe here in the back. When we're hearing something, that's happening here in the temporal lobe. Look at what's going on in your brain when you're just thinking. So when you're processing, when you're trying to understand something, you're planning something, notice how many different places in your brain light up when you're thinking. I always like to contrast that with, look at this one down here, when you're speaking, right? This is why we need to think before we speak, right? Because we use way less of our brain to say things than we do to think about things. So power to any of my introvert friends out there, because I'm an introvert myself. I like to do a lot of this thinking stuff. Little less fond of this whole speaking stuff, right? But you use a lot of your brain when you're thinking, which is why after you study, you're like starving, right? Because you use so much glucose in your brain. You got those neurons, right? With glucose. So toss those out there. Hearing, seeing, speaking, they're kind of localized to one part of the brain, but the highest order thing that you can do, thinking, that uses a whole lot of your brain. So just a fun one to look at there. Here's another fun thing to look at here. If we were in person, I would throw these up on the whiteboard here. These pictures are helping us to see the difference between the primary visual area that we talked about in the occipital lobe and the visual association area. Remember that the association area helps you to figure out what you're seeing. The primary version of these areas just receives that information. So let's start over here with invention A. Can anyone tell from the chat if this wasn't creepy, right? If it wasn't a person's head that has knives in it, what would invention number A be used for? What would this actually be? Can we tell? Yeah, so this would be a knife block, right? A place to store your knives. I joke that I definitely need this, and I definitely need to make sure that I put it like, I don't have a kitchen window, but if I did, I totally should put it like right by a kitchen window, right? So when people are walking by and they see the shadow of the knives in the head, that'd be really creepy, right? So here's, yeah, Jessie says she needs one that looks like her husband. Yeah, that's pretty funny. So our primary visual area helped us to register that, oh, this looks like a face. Oh, this looks like knives. The visual association area helps us to figure out, okay, this is supposed to be a knife block. Okay, let's look at our next one. Not quite as creepy here. This one right here, can we tell what this is? Yeah, so a couple of us are chiming in that this is a Snuggie. Actually, to be a little more accurate, this is a knockoff Snuggie called a Slanket. So I didn't quite get you a Snuggie. I got you the Walgreens version of a Snuggie, right? So this is something called a Slanket, and you can tell that she's got kind of this blanket thing going on, and that blanket has sleeves. So a Slanket, that's what we got going on here. Hey, this little invention up top, what would be the purpose of this thing? Which, by the way, Dr. Allis totally needs to buy, just saying. Yeah, exactly. This would be a cute, socially acceptable way to have child labor, right? So as your baby crawls along on the floor, theoretically they're cleaning the floor too. So my little guy's not crawling yet, but when he starts crawling, I definitely need to get me one of these. Last invention down here. What would be the purpose of this invention right here? What's the job of this? Yeah, exactly. Cool off that ramen, right? Man, I grew up on ramen. I did love me some ramen. So that last thing, we used our primary visual area to see what was there, and the visual association area to figure out what we would use it for. So I want to, just for kicks and giggles, I would love for everyone to vote for me. Let me get my question pool made right here. I would love to see which of those inventions do you think you need. So it might be covering a little bit for you. A, B was that Slanket, C is up here at top, and D is over here. So I want us all, do me a favor and vote. Which of these inventions, if you could have one, which would you most like to have? I should probably vote too. Let's see if it'll let me vote too. I'm voting too. A couple of us haven't responded. More takers? All right, well, overwhelmingly, we are saying that we would love to have the slanket. Yeah, Jesse asked, can we choose more than one? You know, I'm with you there, right? There are multiple of these that I would like to have. This time of year, though, I definitely think I would be in it for that slanket, right? That blanket with sleeves. So visual association area helps you to know what we use these things for. That primary visual area helps you just to see that they're there. So thanks for humoring me for a bit with that. It's always fun to look at some silly things there. So let me look at the questions here. So Jacqueline's question is asking about those special senses. When we talk about special senses, they're all going to have a primary area and then an association area with them. So in particular, when we use this term visual, we're specifically talking about what you see. We also have primary auditory areas and an auditory association area, because I hear something in a different part of the brain and then I process what it is in a different part as well. We're also going to have, so to add to our list, we have a primary gustatory area where taste sensations are first sent, and then we'd have a gustatory association area. So every type of special senses is going to have a primary area and an association area. It's not always going to have this word visual in it, because that's telling me what specific kind of information is there. Does that help with your question, Jacqueline? Yeah, so Nicole is tying it into a great point. When we talk about the association areas of the brain, absolutely, it ties into memory. So the way you make sense of the new stuff in your life is by relating it to old stuff. So the way that we were able to look at this here and realize that knives are being stored inside this wooden head, we could associate that with in the past when we've seen a normal knife block. Or when we look at this picture here, we can associate that this is a baby, and we can associate, oh yeah, that's the stuff we put on mops. So for you to be able to process, we've always got to link it to something old, which is what makes anatomy so hard, right? We're learning all this new stuff that we can't connect to anything yet. So absolutely, this association area definitely has to do with memory, for sure. So Jacqueline, let me see if I find space. We kind of said this before, but here, let me type again to see if we can clear things up. When we first see things, that should not have been areas, just one. When we first see something, it goes to the primary visual area. When I want to figure out what I am seeing, it goes to the visual association area. So I start in the primary visual area, I send it to the visual association area. Down here, my image shows me hearing. So information goes to the primary auditory area first. For me to figure out what I'm hearing, I send it to the auditory association area. If we had a picture of a brain that was tasting, let's pretend we have a tasting brain. That information goes to the primary gustatory area. And for me to figure out what it is I'm tasting, I send it to the gustatory association area. So all of my special senses, except for balance, I don't think balance quite works this way, but all of my other ones, hearing, taste, smell, seeing, we start at a primary area and we end up at an association area to figure out what it is that we are seeing, what it is that we're hearing, or what we're tasting. So primary and secondary That's what's going on with those special senses. General senses are a different story though. So let's talk about those general senses with this super creepy picture, which, by the way, I always joke that I definitely need to hang in my house as prominently as possible. My in-laws already think I'm weird, so why not, right? I'll just blow up this big picture here. What we are looking at in this picture here, this particular one, is called the sensory homunculus. The sensory homunculus. So the sensory homunculus, this homunculus word, like it says in the guided lesson, I want you to think about it as a map. So if you were trying to figure out, when I touch my pencil with my fingers, when I'm trying to figure out where along my post-central gyrus, though that information is sent, exactly which part of my post-central gyrus do I send it to? The homunculus would tell me that. So over here, this portion of that post-central gyrus, the bump behind the central sulcus, that's where information from you touching your pencil is sent to. That's where the neurons that listen for that part of your body, that's where they live. That's totally different from the neurons from your lips, for example, that feel that your coffee cup is hot. And that's totally different from the neurons on the bottom of your feet that feel when you step on that Lego. Ouch, right? We have a map that shows us where we send information that we collect from different places in the body. That map is called the sensory homunculus. Nicole asked the question in the chat, do we need to memorize this map? What do you think? I'm just curious. What do we think about Dr. Ollis? No, I won't make you memorize this map. No. On the exam and on the homework assignments, I will give you this map and ask you to interpret it. I'm trying to remember exactly how I phrased it on the exam. I believe on the exam, I only told you if it's the post-central gyrus or the pre-central gyrus. So we need to know on our own, if I tell you it's the post-central gyrus, you need to know you're looking at the sensory map. Or if I tell you it's the pre-central gyrus, you need to know you're looking at the motor map. So please make sure we're practicing where these different maps are found. The post-central gyrus is the location where the sensory map is found. When we look at this picture, and yeah, a couple of you are referencing those really awesome clay figures that you have in the guided lesson. Those clay figures were made based on the size of the body parts here on the map. So here is a not trick question. When we look at the sizes of the body parts on the map, does it seem like it matches the sizes of the body parts on you? In other words, are the biggest parts of your body the biggest on this map? Only a couple of us have a vote. Yeah, so the biggest parts on your body are not the biggest parts on this map. The biggest part on pretty much everyone's body is things like your torso. The torso, the size of the torso on this map compared to the size of the face, for example, is not the same as in the human body. And the size of the hands, just as big or bigger than the entire torso. When you're looking at this map and looking at the sizes of the various body parts, keep in mind that the sizes of the parts of the body on this map give us an idea of how much sensory information is coming back from each part of the body. So somewhere that's really big, like the face, for example, lots of sensory information comes back from the body to go to the brain. somewhere like the trunk of the body, so your entire torso, not a lot of sensory information comes back from those places. The bigger a body part on the map, the more sensory information comes back from that body part. So based on the size of these body parts, what would we say are some of the places in your body that can collect the most information, the most sensory information? Yeah, so the hands getting a whole bunch of information. The head overall gets a lot of information. I always like to point out, look at how big the size of the lips are, the lips and the nose. So much sensory information coming from those places. The tongue too. We've ignored the foot over here, but look at how big the foot is. The foot collects even more sensory information than your entire torso. The fun thing with this, and we'll look at this with the spinal cord a little bit more too, the fact that there's not a ton of sensory information that comes from your torso. This is why sometimes you can, so if you have a family member or a friend at home, you can put maybe more than one finger down on their back at the same time. And it's hard for them to tell, is that one finger? Is it two fingers? Is it 5 fingers? When there's not a lot of information that comes back from one area, it's tough for us to be able to distinguish between what we're feeling. So the fact that I get a lot of information from my fingers means that I can very clearly tell what I'm touching. I get a lot of sensory information from there. I don't get as much sensory information from my torso. I don't get as much sensory information even from parts of my arm, but a lot of information from my fingers, a lot of information from parts of my face. I do want to point something out right here. When we have the eye on this map, this is touch sensations of the eye. This is not vision, not vision. The kinds of information that we're processing everywhere here on this map. This map is just general sensory information. So general sensory information, a big one is touch. It's also things like temperature. It's also things like stretching, things like pain. Yeah, so great correlation. Things like when you have an eyelash in your eye or some dirt blew into your eye, absolutely. That's the kind of stuff we would see here. Sunlight would not be something that we process here. Sunlight would go to that primary visual area, actually. So those general senses, or the special senses, excuse me, special senses, remember, are things like vision, things like hearing. So when we talk about the eyes, for example, it's just these kind of things. We scratched our eyeball, we're doing weird stuff with our contacts, our eyelids, whatever. That kind of information is detected here. Not things like vision, hearing. When we have the tongue down here, the tongue is not doing taste. So the tongue down here, this is going to be things like the texture of your food. Is it squishy? Is it hard? These are going to be things like the temperature of the food, temperature, etc. Those kind of things, not taste. So taste is a special sense. So this is general sensory information, some of that basic sensory type stuff, not the special stuff that we get to do in lesson number 13. So Nicole is asking a question, yeah, about the nose, because the nose isn't doing smell. Yeah, it's a combination of the skin on the outside of the nose, as well as kind of what you're feeling inside the nose too. So if you have a stuffy nose, you could feel the fact that your nose is stuffy right here on the homunculus as well. It's just not going to be smell information. Under no circumstances is this smell. Just like no circumstances is this taste or vision. It's just those general kinds of things. When you feel like you have to sneeze, that's a good question. I don't know, maybe. Sneezing is a reflex too, so that may come from other parts of the brain as well. So not sure on sneezing, but possibly. And yes, tyranny, fingers would be, it'd be all of these things here in fingers. So touch sensation, texture sensations. Here's a teaser for us when we're talking about the spinal cord and the special senses next time, or in the next unit. Pain is just when we get any of these other sensations too much. So when you bend your finger back too far, or we touch something that's too hot, or we get squeezed when we're touching something, that's what pain is, when we feel a lot of some other sensation. So these general senses, if you ever get too much of them, that's going to register as pain. So the one other thing that we would say is a general sense too. Remind me, the sensory homunculus, which of those lobes in the brain did we say the sensory homunculus is found in? Which lobe of the brain? Yeah, the sensory homunculus is found in the parietal lobe of the brain, parietal lobe of the cerebrum. Remember that it's in the second half or the back half of the brain. It's in the post-central gyrus. The post-central gyrus. One of the things that your guided lesson pointed out to you, and I want to see if we remember here, we're looking at, in this particular picture, I am looking at the right hemisphere of the brain. Which side of the body is this sensory information coming from? If this is the right hemisphere of the brain, yeah, so when we talk about general sensory information, it's actually sent to the opposite side of the body. So the touch information that you see on this part of my homunculus right here, it actually came from the opposite side of the body, the fingers on the opposite side. Same thing here with the features of the face, that's coming from the opposite side. To your question, Nicole, I'm not, it might be called mirroring. I do know the word that we're going to use for it with the spinal cord is something called contralateral. Contralateral, being the opposite side. So one side of the body feels something, the other side of the body detects that. And vice versa, when we go to our motor homunculus, the motor homunculus, we have the opposite. Okay, so I get what you're saying, Nicole. Yep, so how they were complementary, kind of. Yeah, so it's kind of like that. The one side of the brain controls the opposite side of the body. Sure. So this one is the motor homunculus. When we talk about the motor homunculus, who we're saying looks like Jay-Z, I won't comment on that. That's outside of my realm of expertise. But when we're talking about the motor homunculus, the same thing is true, that this is going to be contralateral. Contralateral. So I'm looking at the left hemisphere here. Which side of the body is this controlling? Muscles on which side? Yeah, so this controls the muscles on the opposite side of body. So we're looking at the left hemisphere of the brain, which means this is controlling the right half of the body. Now, this is the motor homunculus. I'll type that word again since it didn't make my image. Motor homunculus. The size of a body part on the motor homunculus shows me how many motor neurons go somewhere. So places on my motor homunculus that are really large would have a lot of motor neurons going to them. Places that are comparatively not as large aren't going to have as many neurons going to them. What are some of the places that have a lot of motor neurons? going to them. Can we tell? Yeah, again, those hands, lots of stuff, especially look at the size of the thumb. Like the thumb is huge. And so the face, the tongue, with the face, this is helping you do all those facial expressions, right? The things that I can't see because we don't have our cameras on, right? But all your facial expressions, that the ability to change so many small things in the way that your face looks and the way you talk, that's because there's a ton of neurons going here, a lot of neurons going to the tongue compared to its size. Because look at this, the entire space that's taken up by your arm, your arm has as many motor neurons going to it as your tongue does. Isn't that crazy? That's why your arm can pretty much just do like flexion and extension and rotation. Your tongue can do all kinds of things. You talk all the time, you chew, all of that happens because we have a lot of motor neurons going there. We can't do as many specific actions or as specific tasks with parts of the body that don't have as many motor neurons. So Jacqueline's question is, she doesn't understand the idea of motor neurons. Yeah, so motor neurons, let's go into this idea a little bit more. What's the function of a motor neuron? What do motor neurons do? Yeah, motor neurons control movement. Motor neurons make things happen. If I have a very small number of motor neurons, there's a very small number of messages that I can send. Because each neuron kind of sends a slightly different message to the parts of the body that it controls. So if I've got 5 motor neurons, for example, that's 5 messages. I can say flex, I can say extend, I can say abduct, adduct, and rotate, maybe, if I've got 5 messages. Compare that to somewhere that maybe there's just 1 motor neuron, and the only message that that 1 motor neuron can send is flex. If I only have 1 neuron, so one little guy that lives right here is the only one that controls this part of the arm. There's only one thing it can do. When I'm looking at the space on your forehead is much smaller than your arm, but there's a lot of different motor neurons that can all send messages to parts of your forehead. If I can send a lot of different messages, I can do really specialized and unique movements, because each neuron can send a message. If one neuron is talking to a bunch of different muscles at the same time, though, they all have to do the same thing. So the size of a body part, it tells me how many motor neurons go to those places in the body, which basically tells me how many different messages I could send to those places in the body. That's why we do all kinds of different movements with our lips and our tongue when we're talking, because we can send all kinds of different messages there to tell those muscles to contract differently. How do we feel about our homunculi, plural of homunculus there? Or what questions do we still have about them? Put another way. So help us out, Jacqueline. Maybe we can help you. What in particular do you feel like, okay, what's an example? So an example of the kind of information we can get from the homunculi, is that kind of what you're asking for? So let's look at, we got the motor one up right now. On page 5 of your packet, there's a critical thinking question. The critical thinking question on page 5 asks you which parts of your body would be able to do the greatest variety of movements. Which parts of our body would be able to do a lot of different things? Can my friends here help me out in the chat? What are some of the places that we could do the greatest variety of movements? or basically the most different things. Okay, so we're saying the hands. In particular, I'm going to say each finger. I'm going to say each finger because look at how big each of those fingers are. Yeah, we're seeing things like face. So in particular, the lips, in particular, the tongue, and kind of the hands in general. Yep, so hands in general. The size of a body part tells me basically how many different movements I can do, because it tells me how much information goes to these places. Lots of information goes to the face. Not a lot of information goes to the arm in comparison. Lots of information goes to the fingers. Not a lot of information goes to the toes. The more information goes there, the more different movements I can do, the more different things I can make happen. Let's go back to the sensory one. The critical thinking question on page 4 of your packet asks about why we would want to use the fingers to read Braille and not the toes. Can my friends here in the chat help me out? Why is it better to use the fingers to read Braille as opposed to the toes? Yeah, besides that it would be disgusting, right, Tierney? It's very true. Yes. Notice that the fingers are so much bigger on this map than the toes are, meaning that the toes don't collect as much sensory information as the fingers do. The fingers collect a lot of sensory information. So the fact that the fingers collect so much sensory information means that there would be more discrimination, or be more clear for you to tell between one bump and two bumps, or two bumps that are on top of each other versus next to each other. The way that you read Braille is discriminating between the bumps that you feel. So we would want to use a part of the body that's bigger, that's collecting more sensory information when I need to do a little task like that, something that requires so much detail, attention to detail. Help me out, Jacqueline. Did that help, or can you phrase your question another way if you still have a question? Help us to help you. Okay. Yeah, so Jacqueline says she's going to keep going over it. So here's kind of the biggest picture, what I think you should be able to do, and the homework assignment will help you to practice this. When we look at the homunculus, whether it's sensory or it's motor, it's going to give you an idea of how much information either comes from that area, when we're talking about the sensory one, or how much information is going back to that area. So the sensory homunculus is all about receiving sensory information. If you receive a lot of sensory information, you can process a lot of things. If you receive just a little sensory information, you're not going to be able to process it very much. You're not really sure what's going on. If you send out a lot of motor information, you can do a lot of different things. If you don't send out a lot of motor information, you can't do very much. So it's all about the number of neurons, or the amount of information that goes to somewhere or comes back from somewhere. Jesse, you have your hand up. Go for it.
Okay, so I have a question. So in the areas that collect more of the sensory information, is that because there's more of the tactile corpuscles or that kind of thing, or is there more sensory neurons in the area?
Yeah, so the tactile corpuscles, that's a great tie-in to lab. Yeah, the tactile corpuscles, if you remember from lab, were things that helped us to detect touch sensations. So yeah, in these places, for example, in the fingers and kind of along the feet, some of the places in the face, we might have a lot of tactile corpuscles. Those tactile corpuscles collect information and then they give it to or kind of pass it off to a sensory neuron. A tactile corpuscle itself would be stuck inside the fingers, but it would connect to or talk with a sensory neuron that would go all the way up to up here, where it could send that information to the brain. So absolutely, we could call it the number of tactile corpuscles down here, or our various structures that collect sensory information. If you're big, you've got a lot of those things. If you're small, not so much. Don't have as many. So yeah, great lab tie-in there. Here's what I'll type it for us in case you don't remember. Tactile corpuscles. Those were those things. They were found right up there at the top of the dermis to help us with touch sensations. Great tie-in there. We mentioned that this was the motor homunculus, the motor map, and we can see here on the slide that this is found in the precentral gyrus. Can you remind me again, which lobe of the brain is the precentral gyrus in? Where's the precentral gyrus? Yeah, that's the one that's in the frontal lobe, the frontal lobe of the brain. So this map, the motor homunculus, we'll type that label over here. The motor homunculus is found in the frontal lobe of the brain. When you're doing the homework assignment, when you're taking the exam, if you see either of these terms, or if you see this one, so precentral gyrus, or if I tell you you're in the frontal lobe, or if I tell you it's the motor homunculus, all of that's a tip-off that we're talking about movement. If I mention the postcentral gyrus or the parietal lobe, all of those are tip-offs for the sensory homunculus. So make sure we remember where these maps are found. Let me check the message here. Yeah, so Jacqueline's question is, when we're looking at the motor homunculus, we're basically correlating that with actions. Yes, that's a great way to think about it. So the bigger the body part, the more actions it can do. When we talk about the sensory homunculus, yeah, the more information I can collect and process. Absolutely. The motor homunculus is all about actions. It's all about movement. The sensory homunculus is all about receiving and processing. Yeah. Now I want to note, when we're looking at the motor homunculus here, the thing that's in the frontal lobe, this is controlling skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle. Remind me in the chat, you do or do not decide when skeletal muscle connects consciously. You do or do not. Yeah, you do. So skeletal muscle, you make a conscious decision when movements happen. The precentral gyrus is where you consciously decide, yeah, where we do voluntary movements. So the part of your brain that helps you to decide that you want to move your fingers in a certain way to write your notes, or that you want to move your lips in a certain way to say particular words. That's what the motor homunculus is controlling. Voluntary movements, what you decide. The motor homunculus decides what movements you're going to do, but the motor homunculus doesn't work alone to make movement happen. The cerebellum also helps to make movement happen. Now here's a quick reminder for us of some lab stuff. Remember that the cerebellum was the structure that's found behind the pons. Here's that big bump. That is the pons. In between the pons and the cerebellum, there is this fluid-filled open space down here. This is called the fourth ventricle. The fourth one was the one at the very bottom. And if you look really close in the picture here, we actually have some choroid plexus. Does anyone remember from our lab lesson a couple weeks back? What does the choroid plexus do? Anyone remember? Yeah, this is this is the leaky blood vessels that make cerebrospinal fluid. And we'll talk a little bit more about those next time in class tomorrow when we make this cerebrospinal fluid at the choroid plexus. We're looking at this picture though because we care all about the cerebellum back here. So when we look at the cerebellum, a couple of structures that we see, and we mentioned these in lab. The first one is called the Arbor Vitae. The Arbor Vitae, that's this white matter that you see here in the middle of the cerebellum. Arbor Vitae means the tree of life. So the tree of life here in the middle of the cerebellum, attached to it, I mentioned this for you, oops, let's try again. When we were talking about this in lab, the gray matter of the cerebellum is called folia, which means leaves. So all of these little bumps that are here on the cerebellum are called the folia, and they're attached to the tree of life, leaves on the tree of life. A couple of fun facts about the cerebellum. There are just as many neurons that live in the cerebellum as there are that live in the entire cerebrum. So when you're thinking about the sizes of these parts of the brain, their sizes are way different, but the cerebellum is so folded up. Look at all of these little folds that it has on top of it. There's a ton of neurons that live inside this little thing, which is why, like I mentioned, if you're looking for an article to do for your current events in anatomy, look up those articles about people that are born without a cerebellum. It's not just a balance thing. It's also involved in some communication skills, for example, some social skills. There's a ton of neurons that live here inside this cerebellum. We're going to focus on the cerebellum in our class in the context of how it works with the precentral gyrus to help you with movement. When we talk about the cerebellum, think about the cerebellum maybe as a kind of like spell check, we'll say, or kind of like autocorrect, perhaps. So what happens is the precentral gyrus sends directions. It sends those directions down to the skeletal muscles. The skeletal muscles move. And as the skeletal muscles are moving, information about the movement comes back to the cerebellum. Now the cerebellum kind of got what you might call a carbon copy or an extra set of directions. The precentral gyrus primarily sent its orders to those muscles in the body, but it also sent a copy to the cerebellum. The cerebellum reads the directions that the precentral gyrus sent. It compares that information to what it feels like in your body when your body's moving. If for some reason your body's not quite moving correctly, the cerebellum sends out corrections. So I kind of like to think about this when you've been sitting for a long time in class and then your foot falls asleep and you stand up and start trying to walk like normal. Your cerebellum realizes you look a little bit funky, you're walking a little bit weird, and it's going to help you make those corrections. So when we think about the cerebellum in our class, think about the cerebellum as what keeps you not looking funny when you're walking around, when you're doing movements, because it's comparing what you're doing to what you wanted to do to make sure that it's happening fluidly, to make sure it's happening the way that it's supposed to. Now we can see this best when we think about the roadside sobriety test. So the roadside sobriety test is when somebody else, not you, right, gets pulled over by a cop. what are some of the things, so the cop suspects that somebody, your neighbor, let's say, had a little too much to drink. What are some of the things that a cop might ask you to do if they suspect that you've been drinking? What do we do in this sobriety test? Roadside sobriety test. Okay, so yeah, so walk a line, walk a straight line. Let's see, stand on one foot. Yep, stand on one foot. Touch your nose. Yep. Watch the pen and don't move your head. Yeah, so tracking with things. Yeah, so all of these are functions that your cerebellum helps to send corrections or helps to allow your body to do well. So for example, standing on one foot, which I always like to show my students that I can't do it very well, even when I promise I haven't been drinking, right? I have trouble standing on one foot balancing normally. My cerebellum is supposed to help me balance. If my cerebellum is impaired, which here's the thing with the cerebellum, you start drinking and it goes straight to the cerebellum. It is highly susceptible to the effects of alcohol. So when I start messing up my cerebellum, suddenly my balance is going to be off. Things like walking a straight line or touching my nose. Walking a straight line involves you needing to put one foot in front of the other foot, in front of the other foot. Those are movements that you would constantly need to fine tune, not only to make sure you don't fall over, but to make sure your feet go in the right place. If your cerebellum isn't sending out corrective orders, you might step all over the place. We might end up over here because the cerebellum's not sending corrections. Or when they ask you to touch your nose, sometimes they ask you to touch your nose with your eyes closed. That's really heavily relying on the cerebellum to figure out, where is my hand at as I move it through space? Where is my nose at as I move things through space? So when you think about that roadside sobriety test, the kinds of activities that they make you do are the kinds of things that the cerebellum is important for. Helping you with your balance, making sure you don't look funny or look drunk, shall we say. When your cerebellum's not working, you look like a drunk person. Let's just be honest. Christina's got a question. Go for it.
So it's just to clarify something on the packet from the guided lesson. On page 6, it says it collects motor information about what should be happening. And then also it says it compares that to the sensory information that about what is actually happening. Shouldn't those two be switched? Because I thought motor is what is actually happening, and then sensory is what should be happening.
So that's a good clarifying question. Absolutely. When we talk about the way that the cerebellum works, think about it. It's taking the directions that the precentral gyrus is sending, which those directions are motor directions. So it's directions that were being sent, which were motor directions telling us what to do. And it's comparing that to the sensory information coming back from your muscles that are saying, hey, I'm contracting, or that's coming from your ear saying, hey, we're tilting sideways, we're going to fall over. So your ability to know what your body's doing is because of the sensory information that you collect. The directions for what you're supposed to be doing are motor information. So those blanks that you're mentioning on page 6, I see those there. Maybe you can say, you can cross out that word collects. Instead of saying it collects motor information, maybe you should just cross it out and say it receives the motor information about what we're supposed to be doing. So that information comes from the precentral gyrus. It sends us an extra copy to the cerebellum. And the cerebellum listens to the sensory information that's coming from the body about what the body's actually doing. So it's not flip-flopped, but I can definitely see where the question came from for sure. All right, well, we are out of time for today to keep you on track as you continue working through this lesson, I'll just mention that there's one more structure involved in movement to be familiar with, and that's the basal nuclei. So way back at the beginning of our class session, Nicole had asked about what the basal nuclei do. So the basal nuclei help you to prevent unwanted movements. And to help you understand what that looks like, there's a couple of disorders that you'll be reading about. The two disorders that we're looking at are Parkinson's disease and then something called Tourette's syndrome. So keep in mind as you're working through this part of the lesson and moving on, one last movement structure that's important, and those are those basal nuclei. So movement doesn't just happen with one part of the brain. Lots of parts of the brain involved in that. That's kind of a big picture idea that I want us to grasp. Are there any last minute questions before we wrap up for today? Or I need to give you guys your penguin. Are you talking about the basal nuclei tyranny, or what in particular are you asking if they'd be the interneurons? Yeah, so the basal nuclei are definitely going to have interneurons. Interneurons are actually going to kind of be all over the place in gray matter. So we do have a lot of interneurons in the basal nuclei, as we do in the cerebellum too. Any part of the brain that has to do processing and figuring out how we should be responding or what we should or shouldn't be doing, definitely going to find some interneurons there for sure. Any other last minute questions? All right, well, tomorrow we're going to wrap up this lesson. If possible, try to work through the rest of the pages of the notes packet so you have a general idea of what we're talking about. We will wrap that up tomorrow. This assignment for lesson number 11, I bumped the due date to Sunday. Your assignment checklist says Friday. I have a feeling that a lot of people would miss the deadline if I left it on Friday, so I moved it to Sunday. But keep in mind that there are also the group wiki and the current events in anatomy that are also due Sunday, along with your lab material. So maybe try to wrap it up a little bit earlier, just to make sure you have enough time to get everything done. So we'll finish this during our class tomorrow at 9:30, and then we will dive our way into a weekend of studying, right? Yeah, so Hannah, the lesson number 11 assignment from lecture, that's this brain stuff. If you look at the assignment checklist, it says that it's due on Friday. Went ahead and moved that due date on that lecture assignment to Sunday night. So you have a little more time to do the assignment. All right, well, I'm going to turn off our recording. Best of luck to my friends watching it on the recording, and hope to see you at a session soon.